Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class this afternoon. Thank you for joining me, whether you are watching live or you are watching the recording later on. I always appreciate you getting involved in your education and getting involved in these live streams to hopefully learn a little something extra that will help you out in your quizzes, in your projects, everything as we approach the course and continuing in the course. And one of the big focuses in our module this week is about accessibility and ensuring accessibility on our online classes. And I know we talk a little bit about accessibility in Web 115, but what we talk about accessibility in relation to that class is essentially about kind of some basic stuff on making things accessible. In this course, we talk more about designing toward the end of accessibility. So a lot of these things that we learn in both classes overlap, but there are some new things here that you're getting for the first time. And it's always good to have a little bit of a refresher here as we approach, learning something new with this topic. And so just really quickly as we begin, we are roughly halfway through our semester. So we want to make sure everybody is, feeling good about things. I'm a little behind personally, just with everything that's been going on in the office and such. So I'm a little behind on getting some things done that I want to get done. So bear with me, but we'll be contacting people pretty soon just to touch base with you all and make sure you're feeling good about things going into the last half of the semester. But we're talking about accessibility. And when we're talking about accessibility, I think one of the most important things that we need to do first is kind of define the idea of accessibility that we're going to be talking about. And we got a picture here of our good friend Tim Berners-Lee. And he says that the power of the web is in its universality. Universality. That's a big word, right? The universality of it all. And when we are examining the idea of universality, what exactly does that mean? It's universal. It is for everyone. And so when we're looking at something that, we want to say the web is supposed to be for everyone and accessed by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect of the web, as Tim Berners-Lee has said. I think that puts into perspective almost exactly what we would be looking for in our core sort of idea of accessibility for a web designer. Right? Access by everyone regardless of disability. And really it should be a big goal, regardless of the field that you're designing something for, to make a site that's accessible, right? Like if you're making a site for e-commerce, like you can almost look at it that way from like a purely capitalistic standpoint, right? Like how can I design a site that can have the most possibility or the highest possibility of having people buy things? Well, one of the ways that we do that is we increase our customer base. So if we have an accessible website, that's even more people that can buy from us. Which, in and of itself isn't exactly the egalitarian worldview that we might be looking for as we're approaching the concept of accessibility. But it does speak to the idea that the web is for everyone. And I think, especially, over the last 2 years or so, as the world has kind of been what it has been, not quite 2 years yet. Looking at about 20 months or so, give or take a little bit. But, we've seen a lot of things move from the physical realm to the virtual realm. And when things that are requirements for all of us to do, things like paying our taxes, things like scheduling important appointments, things like, filling out important paperwork for whatever, what have you, paying bills, whenever all this stuff goes solely virtual, right? That also further exhibits the need for accessibility, right? And actually a more accessible web is really a benefit to everybody. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The next bullet point I have here is about the Ignatian concept of inclusion. And, I was talking about this, several years ago in this class. I had a student who was Catholic, and I thought I'd throw in this concept of the importance of accessibility for them, because when we look at Ignatius, Saint Ignatius of Loyola is kind of what we're talking about here. So we're talking about this level of spirituality, and really what I'm trying to get at here is sort of this higher moral plane. So whereas we say, we talk about like our Tim Berners-Lee quote here, we're looking at the universality of the internet, and there's, pragmatic purposes for the universality of the internet. Things that aren't strictly just like because it's a good thing to do, right? We want to be able to get paid. We want to be able to get our resources. We want to be able to order food and have it sent to us. Having this universality where everybody can use our programs and everybody can use our services through the internet means more money. But on top of that, we have this sort of spiritual, sort of this higher moral plane idea that, it's basically just a good thing to do. It's just the right thing to do. And, one of the key points of like Ignatian spirituality is in all things to love and to serve, right? So when we're thinking about inclusion and accessibility in that manner, it moves past just kind of some of these pragmatic things about wanting everybody to be able to use the internet for all of the internet's purposes, and moves into these ideas of, well, we want to love our fellow man and we want to serve people, right? And in loving people and serving people, we make accessible websites that these people can use. Because that's what the Lord or whatever, deity or whatever, that's what they want you to do. Right? So part of making these good decisions is making them through the eyes of service and love and these concepts. So we've got this sort of pragmatic thing, right? We want people to be able to buy our products. We have this sort of higher moral plane sort of thing that we do it because it's just the right thing to do. And then finally, in certain cases, not necessarily in all cases, but it's the law. Accessibility is the law. There are, under the federal government, any government sites and any sites that are created by entities that receive government funding have the federal Section 508 legal standards to deal with. Now, in comparison to the Wacag, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, Federal Section 508 standards, very low. Not a real high bar to cross there. But we also have Americans with Disabilities Act Law. And more we're starting to see that applied to the web, right? So, if you're offering an experience in your storefront and you're having to, meet Americans with Disabilities Act laws in order for all people to be able to come into your store and shop, we're starting to see more and more of these ADA regulations applied to a virtual space. So more than our federal Section 508 standards, we're starting to see these laws and resulting lawsuits coming from improperly accessible websites because it is it's discriminatory. If you have people that aren't able to access your website but need to use your service for whatever reason. So we have these different ideas. We have these three sort of big ideas surrounding why we need accessibility and what the purpose of accessibility is. Right? And they look at it from three really different avenues of how we can think about accessibility. But I think just as important as it is to consider what accessibility is, I think it's also important to consider what accessibility is not. Right? When we're working with accessibility and designing for accessibility, one of the big things is that we want equivalent experiences. Right? And we talked about experience. Experience has been a through line from the start of class until now. We're talking about creating an equivalent experience for someone who needs to utilize assistive technologies versus someone who does not need to utilize assistive technologies to interact with a website. And I think the big thing here is this equivalent experience. And one of the big things that I've heard kind of said about accessibility is that, people should be able to access your site or your material in the same way, at the same time, anybody else could. All right, like say, for example, you want to order a new pair of shoes from the website at a certain time of day. And during that certain time of day, you can go on and you can make purchases from the website. If you are, if you don't need any assistive technology. Let's say in this hypothetical scenario, the website is completely inaccessible and you can't order from it. Or maybe we'll make it something more important that would be like a higher, of a higher legality. Like maybe you need to, pay your water bill. Or else they'll turn your water off, right? And it's with your local municipality there. And you can pay the bill on the website at any time of day. And as long as you get your payment in by midnight, everything's A-okay. Well, let's say hypothetically for a moment, the site isn't accessible. And their accessibility option for individuals with disabilities is to call the call center and pay over the phone. Well, what if the call center closes at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 7 o'clock in the evening? I want to make my payment at 8, 9, 10 o'clock. I should be able to do that. Right? I should be able to access the website, make my payment, allow my water to stay on, just like anybody else who would have unfettered access to the website would be able to do. So our goal for accessibility is creating this equivalent experience, but it's not some of these things that people try to do from time to time, like creating text-only pages. Now, text-only pages are perfectly accessible. Right? That's one of the things about them. Like if it's just text on a page, just black text on a white page, you're about as accessible as you can get. But That's not really like what the web is supposed to be. That's more of a cop out than anything else. Right? And even still, like text only pages only take you so far. Like if you're doing e-commerce, if you're doing something where your users need to fill out a form, if you're working with, anything interactive really. A text only page doesn't go far enough because it's more than just disseminating information. So we can't just hang our hat on an idea that text only pages would be perfectly accessible for us, because they won't be. Another thing is to have a separate accessible version. And this goes back to that idea of equivalent experience. Right? If I have a separate version that's accessible, that experience is not equivalent. I want to try to make sure that I have an equivalent experience. I shouldn't have to go to a completely separate website to have access to accessible services. But now with that being said, like you might think, well, if we just simplify things and we make things as easy as possible and just make them boring, then it'd be easy to make an accessible website. And to a degree, that's true, but it's easy to make a website that is accessible out of really any website. Right? As long as we're following certain guidelines, as long as we're examining things and working with things in a certain way, an accessible website doesn't have to be boring, and it certainly doesn't have to be difficult. Like some little bitty things, and these are the kinds of things that we looked at back when we looked at accessibility in Web 1.15. There are just some little bitty things that you can do to help improve your accessibility. Right? Maybe things like, I'm going to use my semantic tags instead of divs. I'm going to use semantic tags. I'm going to use a main. I'm going to use a nav. I'm going to use a menu. I'm going to use a section. I'm going to use a header. Right? I'm going to use these semantic tags instead of just divs and try to give them meaning later on. I'm going to use Aria Roles where I need to, right? Like has pop out equals true, right? We can add that to things that are interactive that has something else that pops up off of it. Just so it can take and refocus the content with the screen reader whenever it needs to do that. So a bunch of little things. If you do the little things all together and you do them right, you can make a beautiful website perfectly accessible as easily as possible. Right? It's not one of those things where it has to be difficult and what you end up with is just dull and boring and nobody wants to use it. Right? One of the things that I like to point out is that disabilities are more common than you might think. Right? And that's another one of the big things that that people kind of think is that, individuals with disabilities are outliers. There aren't that many of them around. We don't need to worry about them because there's just a few of them. But a lot of people use assistive technologies. You might even use an assistive technology and you don't even realize it. Right? I do. I use assistive technology. I have glasses. Right? Glasses are an assistive technology. If we look at the if we look at the basic definition for an assistive technology, it's a piece of technology that kind of augments or supplements what your body is able to do. Right? So like if I take my glasses off and I try to even read my monitor in front of me, I won't be able to do it. Right? I'm like 3 feet away from my monitor right now. If I take my glasses off and try to read what's on my monitor, I can't. At all. Right? It's just blurs of shapes and colors. But with my glasses on, with my assistive technology in place, I can read everything fine. And when we move to the web, we see those kinds of we see different types of assistive technologies put into use. But at the same time, what we're seeing is this breakdown of a barrier to access. Right? Because an individual's an individual might need this augmentation to be able to interact with something normally. They might need a screen reader. They might need a tactile browser. They might need, or a tactile keyboard rather. They might need some kind of screen magnification software, right? Like there's a whole bunch of different assistive technologies that are used on the web that allow you to take and break down these barriers to access. Take and make like it were like when I look at my monitor without my glasses, I can't see. Take it from that state to a state where I can see and read things just fine. Right? Take it from a state where people can't read or interact with the content to a state where they can read and interact with the content just fine. And when we're not considering accessibility, a big issue here is that we're essentially building barriers instead of breaking them down. Which I think is one thing that a lot of people don't really think about, is that when we are approaching building a site and we're not worrying about implementing accessibility onto that site, we're not actively solving any problems. In fact, we're creating new ones. Right? Because when you don't have accessibility implemented properly on your site, then these assistive technologies don't quite work as they should. And in some cases, it's just minorly, right? In those cases, it would be like somebody coming up to me and maybe rubbing their greasy fingerprints on my glasses. And in some cases, they impair you big time, right? Like they just come up and just rip my glasses off my face and throw them on the ground and break them. Right? That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. When we're avoiding accessibility, we're actively building barriers, and that's an issue. And along with the recording of this video that I posted in the course today, I'm also going to post another video that shows the use of assistive technologies in action, because I think those types of things are good to see. That's one of the big things that really keyed me in on the importance of accessibility as I was, I went out to the campus of Utah State University, the home of WebAIM, the Web Accessibility, what does that stand for? WebAIM. It's eluding me right now. Web Accessibility in Mind. The Web Accessibility in Mind WebAIM organization has its home on the campus of Utah State University. And I went out there for training several years ago. And a part of the training was we got to see an individual who was blind, still is, I presume, utilize a screen reader to interact with a website. And seeing how that assistive technology really broke down those barriers to access with the site. Seeing an instance where, a site was not built with accessibility in mind versus an instance where the site was built with accessibility in mind, and how it was night and day. This was huge, right? And hopefully you all will kind of understand that too by watching this video that I'll be posting along with the recording. Now, some designers will comment on things like edge cases, right? And that's that mentality that we kind of mentioned just a moment ago, where people have this idea of, well, there aren't that many, right? There are only a few. There are only a few people that have these sorts of afflictions. There are only a few people that this really applies to. They're edge cases. We don't have to worry about them. They're such a small segment of our user base. They won't have a big impact on our bottom line. We can just kind of push them to the side. Everything will be fine. Right? And so you might hear this term edge case kind of batted around. And really, talking about a person as an edge case, just in general, sounds skeevy to me, right? Like you could talk about edge cases in regards to like troubleshooting and like bugs in software. That's fine. Because it's like, oh, like if I do this specific thing and this specific thing and this specific thing, then the program crashes. Well, if there's a high likelihood that those three specific things will rarely ever be done in a row, you can call that an edge case and kind of push that, maybe down the road on your roadmap a little bit. But kind of referring to people as an edge case and individuals as an edge case, that's kind of gross, right? Like it's dehumanizing, and it takes people and it puts them just, as something different. And I don't care for that at all. And really, when it comes to people, right, there are no edge cases. Right, now think about it this way. Right, Facebook has claims to have over 2 billion users. We'll use 2 billion here as a nice round number, but they grow every day, right? So, it could even be 3 billion by now. Who knows? But Facebook claims to have over 2 billion users. 2 billion users. That's a lot. What about 1%? 1% of these 2 billion users. What if we said 1% of these 2 billion users fall in this certain category, so they don't really matter? Just 1%. When we say it like that, when we say, oh, just 1%, that sounds like a small number. It sounds like a small number to say, oh, it's just 1%. But 1% of 2 billion is 20 million people. 20 million people. That's 20 million people you're leaving out. That's like leaving out entire countries. Right? Like the country of Chile. They have a little over 19 million people in the population. The Netherlands have a little over 17 million people. Right? There are a bunch of countries on the face of the planet that have less than 20 million. Greece. 20 million people, 1% of the 2 billion users that Facebook has or claims to have is just slightly smaller than the entire national populations of Greece and Portugal combined. Greece has about 10.4 million. Portugal has about 10.1 million. So when you put those together, it's about 20.5 million. Right, so there's about 500,000 people difference there. But we could say, like, oh, maybe Hungary and Sweden combined. I have a list open here in another window. Don't think I know all the world's populations, right? I have a list open here of the country's populations, right? But Sweden is almost 10.1 million. What we say, Hungary is about 9.6, right? So that's two countries that have less total people than 1% of Facebook's users. And so when we look at things that way, and we look at things kind of in relation to this idea of 1%, right? 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but 20 million is a ton of people. And we can't leave out 20 million people. That's wild, right? So what can we do? What can we do? Right, like let's look at a lot of this stuff. You look at a little bit at Aria in the class. We've talked about semantic HTML5 tags in the past. We've got some good just rules of thumb here, and these are all easy, right? These are all easy things that we can do, like adding descriptive alt text for all images, right? One of the things that we want to remember, and we'll talk about this here in a second, that our alt text should work as a description of an image instead of just like describing, or the description of purpose of an image instead of just describing the content of the image. Good contrast, use a larger font size, representing all written content in plain text, not images. That's also good for you if you don't have any other accessibility needs, because there are instances where that can cause big problems. Using semantic HTML5 tags, using Aria markup, and just being mindful in general, just being conscious of the needs that people have. So let's look at some of these, like descriptive alt text. But when we're talking about descriptive alt text here, we're talking about being descriptive of the purpose of the image, right? Because that's the expression that we want to give to our user, is what is the purpose of this image. If the purpose of this image is purely decorative, then we can just use empty alt tags there to let the screen reader know that it can avoid this. It doesn't have to worry about it. Right? But if it has a purpose and we have meaning behind this image, we want to be able to convey the same meaning to sighted users versus users who utilize a screen reader to interact with the website. So we need to have this purpose in alternate text. Contrast ratios. Right, so we're wanting to ensure a proper contrast ratio for people who are, either colorblind or maybe users with low vision, so you can make out the differences between, the colors on a website and read the different, read text. Right, and the standard minimum contrast ratio for just standard size text is 4.5 to 1 in our Wacag standards. Now we have a website here that takes us to the WebAIM contrast checker. And on this site, really, we can get ourselves a good idea of what would pass and what would fail. Because we hear like, oh, we need a lot of contrast. But we don't really need that much contrast. Like, 4.5 to 1 is a decent amount of contrast, but if we're working within our constraints, we'll be okay. Right, like here we see a nice, like a royal blue here, right, as our foreground color, as our text color, and that is way within the bounds of what is considered acceptable for accessibility. Right, like watch how far I have to take this bar before we are unaccessible. We're going to be looking at the Wacag AA normal text here, because that's the 4.5 to 1 accessibility ratio that we're looking for. And we failed there. So there's the pass. That's a pass. That's a fail. And using a tool like this is really great, so we can just make sure that everything kind of works. Now, one of the interesting things is if we start going the other way with this, colors aren't off limits just because they're light. We can come up with something creative, like this is a pass. It's a pass for AA normal text size. It's a pass for AA and AAA large text size. And really, if we are, when we've talked about Wacag AAA in the past, we've kind of said that it's a nice to have. Like the goal everybody shoots for is Wacag AA. It's nice for things to fall within Wacag AAA. Can we even get that out of this color? I don't even think we can get AAA out of this color at all. But we can definitely get a nice contrast ratio for AA, which is pretty cool. And so I'd like for you all to use this website. I think I have a link. I might have a link to this website. I should have a link to this website in your course. They also just have a lot of other resources on the WebAIM site here. Different checklists for Wacag and Section 508. Different references there. They have the contrast checker, a color reliant link contrast checker, common look PDF plugin, and the Wave, which is pretty cool. The Wave Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. You can enter a web page address in here, like say clevelandcc.edu, and it'll give you kind of this cursory accessibility report, things that are issues, things that aren't issues. And we can go through and we can view the details, because some of the things matter and some of them don't. So you get this report, and you kind of have to go through and work with it. And I bet I know why a lot of these are returning inaccessible, and so I probably need to talk to the folks upstairs so we can help fix that. But you can also see all the instances of Aria labels. You can even, they used to have it to where you can actually see which ones are being used. Yeah, like right here we have role equals image, role equals image, role equals image. These are Aria labels that are in use here. And that's good to use for like icons and such, that maybe you use emojis, or maybe you use something, some other kind of symbol font library to create icons. But it just gives you some cursory information, and it's something interesting to kind of look at if you want to look at it in relation to, maybe some of your favorite sites. That's at wave.webaim.org. And the color contrast checker, that is at webaim.org/resources/color contrast. Now you've heard me mention the Wacag Standards, and you might remember the Wacag Standards a little bit from Web 115. Wacag stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and these are established by the World Wide Web Consortium's WAI, or Web Accessibility Initiative. In fact, like when you hear about Aria, for example, you might see it written as WAI-Aria. And it's because it was developed by these same people at the World Wide Web Consortium. Now, you remember the World Wide Web Consortium from other classes. That was the organization founded by Tim Berners-Lee. They kind of set the standards for, the markup that we use for web development. And so they're also dealing with accessibility here as well. Wacag 2.0 was established in 2008 and extended into 2.1 in 2018. They're expected to come out with new guidelines soon. But I think they might have some guidelines that are kind of in the comment stage right now, kind of in a public review type of stage. And they contain 3 levels of accessibility: level A, level 2A, and level 3A. And I kind of went through and I just kind of cherry picked some standards from each of the levels for us to kind of look at here. And they're things that we have to consider as we're kind of going in. Like our level A standards should be the easiest ones for us to complete. And these are expanded. Some of these are expanded by higher level standards. Without question, we should be completing level A standards, right? For example, non-text content, providing alternative descriptions for non-text content, giving our pictures alt text, essentially. Having captions and videos, creating a logical structure in our websites. And in that, we're talking about using our headings in the right order. That's one of the things there. The use of color, not using a presentation that relies solely on color. I've got a good slide here on the next slide that goes deeper into that. Having that page title there, right? We should always have those title tags in our head filled in, right? That's not just W3C compliant code, which it is, which you should be doing. You should have been doing that anyway because of to make our code W3C compliant. But it's also one of the baseline accessibility tools that we use to kind of make our sites accessible. So you need those title tags filled in. The link purpose in context. This is the link purpose in context, which means if you have a link, you should be able to tell what it is based on the text around it. Now, this is one that's expanded upon in later levels. Right, because I think it's level 2A, maybe level 3A, that says it's not enough just to be able to get the purpose of the link from the information around it. The purpose of the link should be in the link. The link should be itself descriptive. And to me, that's the one that I want you all to err to, right, is having the link itself be descriptive. Because one of the things that these screen readers can do is, well, they can pull a list of all the links on the page. You know, just like you can scan through a page and see all the links because they look visually distinct from the rest of the text on the page, a screen reader can look through and it can pull out links and give our user a list of links. So what if the text for every link was just click here, click here, click here, click here, click here, over and over and over again? Doesn't sound like it'd be too good to be able to interact with that. Labels or instructions, label elements and give instructions for interaction, affordances, but more importantly, signifiers. And just building all elements for accessibility, making sure everything has a name, making sure everything has a role, making sure values are present when they need to be. But let's deeper dive into that use of color for a second. Right, when we say using color, we're talking about using color to convey meaning and only using color to convey meaning. And this is something that I've seen a lot, right? Like, and you've probably even seen it in interfaces. Where like, oh, we have this interface. I don't need to be zoomed in for this. I can zoom out if it'll let me. Well, let's just go with it from here. Oh, I have this interface. If something's good, it has a green dot. If it's bad, well, it has a red dot. Well, what if I'm colorblind? What if I can't distinguish between my reds and my greens? What if they look very, very similar? Then it's just a dot. I don't know if things are going well, if things are going poorly. Right, we have another example of that here. You know, required fields are in red. Well, the contrast here is very different, and if I was colorblind, I might not be able to tell that that is red. And if I'm reading things with a screen reader, I wouldn't know that that is red. So I wouldn't know that that is required. Versus color and a symbol, saying required fields are in red and are marked with an asterisk. So now not only is it a color, but it has another visual signifier to it that sets it apart as a required field. And this is really beneficial, right? This isn't just beneficial to your users with disabilities, but it's also beneficial to all of your users because we're able to more quickly and easily distinguish these elements visually. Another example there below it. I mean, imagine that first one there if you were colorblind. Which is the right angled triangle? Green, blue, red, yellow, don't know. In this case, if you were colorblind and you couldn't distinguish these colors very well for whatever reason, you'd have to answer don't know. Right? Because there's no distinction to these triangles that we're being given here in this question other than the color. Right? Versus having it also labeled with a number, which is what we see on the right-hand side there. Green has the number 1, blue has the number 2, red has the number 3, yellow has the number 4. Then you have don't know, which isn't on the screen, of course. And so with that, we could easily answer, well, it's green. It's 1. Because I can see 1 and I know green and, you know, I can see 1. 1's beside green. I know that. I can tell it's a right triangle. We're good. Let's look at some of our level 2A standards. This is where our contrast ratio comes into play, right? Our minimum contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. Text can be resized to 200% without loss of content or function, which should be really easy if your page is responsive, right? You shouldn't have any problems with that at all if you're designing for if you're working toward responsive web design and you're using all of those tools there. Images of text, don't use images of text. Why? Right? A lot of people use images of text to convey things because you can make a font nice and pretty in Photoshop, and then that's what you have. Right? But that text isn't real, right? Like my screen reader can't read the text out of that image. There's no OCR that'll do that for me. So especially if there's information in that image that I need to be able to do whatever I need to be able to do for, you know, completing whatever task it is I need to complete, I need to have that information in something that can be read to me or something that I can utilize and figure out. Right? So if you have this big wall of text in an image, that's indiscernible. Headings and labels, using clear headings and labels on everything, having a consistent navigation, right? Could you imagine like one of these things that's just a good best practice of user experience design, having consistent navigation is also a strong indicator of good accessibility, as well as like using icons and buttons consistently. Remember back when we talked about our CRAP principles, contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity, and we said they're the foundations of good design. And now we're talking about how these things like contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity work to help us bolster accessibility and make more accessible sites. It's almost like good design rules and good accessibility best practices overlap. Right? And if we're just designing things well, some of the things that are issues with accessibility will take care of themselves. Which is amazing. Now let's look at some of the 3A standards. These are some of the 3A standards. And there's that link purpose, link only I was talking about there. It's a 3A standard, but that's an easy one to do with a 3A standard. That's an easy one. Break up content with headings. Explain any strange words. Explain any abbreviations. Write at a 9th grade reading level. That's something that we don't think about a whole lot, is it? You know, when we think about accessibility and disabilities in this sort of way, a lot of times all we think about are physical disabilities. But there are cognitive disabilities as well that we need to consider if we want to make our site completely accessible. And so if we have any words that are jargon words that only people who know kind of the things that we're talking about would know, well, they need to be explained. They need to be defined. Same thing with abbreviations. What does this abbreviation mean? Especially like if you've gotten into the alphabet soup of different abbreviations, of different acronyms and initialisms over time, then you know that there's a lot of those initialisms and acronyms that overlap, that multiple places use. So which one is it? What does it mean? And then we get into reading level with this readability, and that sounds familiar. That almost sounds like a concept we talked about last week. Writing toward a reading level for readability. It's almost like all this stuff kind of fits together. Pretty crazy, I know. But again, our level 3A standards, a lot of these can be applied easily without really bogging you down. And if you can apply them easily without them really bogging you down, go for it. You should do that. But some of them are a bit tougher, and they do create more limitations on you. And, really, if you've got a good 2A standard met, 3A is just kind of those good to haves. Right, a lot of times. If you have a specific audience that needs the 3A standards met, then we can do that. But as long as you are... but for the vast majority of cases, the 2A standards are going to meet the needs of basically everyone. WAI Aria. We mentioned them just a minute ago. We talked about Aria. WAI is that web accessibility initiative from the W3C. Aria stands for Accessible, Rich Internet Applications. And really, Aria just kind of acts as this sort of CSS for assistive technologies. And we can actually pull up their website. It is a subpage on the W3C website. And we can check them out. And we can see the kinds of markup here that we can use for Aria. We've got Aria authoring practices, right? How we write Aria. And here's a big one here. No Aria is better than bad Aria. That's a good one to just kind of scroll there and stop on for a minute. Right, because when we're looking at Aria and Aria roles and states and properties, they're like CSS for assistive technologies. There, it says that again. So our screen readers are essentially rendering the non-visual experience. Right, so if we tell people the wrong thing about an element, that's worse than just not telling them anything about it at all. Because when you tell them the wrong thing, that creates expectations. I mean, they call it here a promise, and I think that's a good word for it. Right? And I think their example here is excellent. Div role equals button / div. Is a div a button? Is a div clickable? Can I click on that and place an order? I cannot. Right? But I'm telling Aria it's a button. So it's made this promise to Aria that this is a button when it's not a button. Right? Like, adding this Aria role to it doesn't give it just magic powers, right? It's not going to provide it with any other abilities. It's just telling the screen reader what this is supposed to be. But if I tell it it's supposed to be the wrong thing, well, that's pretty tough. Right? And we can kind of go through, like, this is a whole, like, we could do a whole class, right? Like, if we look through here on the left-hand side, this is all just documentation for Aria. Buttons. And we have examples of buttons. Alerts. Breadcrumbs. Checkboxes. Combo boxes. All this different kind of stuff. And they all come with examples like these table examples here. And they give us attributes as to what we could add. And examples of accessible versions of it. But, I mean, you can see, like, there's a whole lot of stuff in this documentation guide. I mean, we could do practically an entire class just on this. Right? So this is another one of those instances where mindfulness plays the big part. I'm going to be mindful that these are things that I might need to do, and I'm going to use the documentation that they provide to help me solve these problems. Right? So as a web developer and as a web designer, having the Aria website kind of bookmarked is a good thing that you'll want to do. And in fact, I said it here, no Aria is better than bad Aria. I mean, that's basically kind of what we just said, so we'll just skip right over that. We can talk about the different things there, that roles, states, and properties that we mentioned. A role just defines the type of user interface element that an HTML element is representing. So if you use a button tag, you don't need to do role button because it already is represented by role button. But if you're using some kind of non-standard link in place of a button, you add role button to it, then the screen reader kind of sees it as a button. States and properties, they support the Aria roles. So these are kind of like attributes or rules for different roles, right? Like I can have something hidden or shown for a specific role. I can have, there are all sorts of states and properties. And these are supportive of roles. And these are things that, again, you're going to want to look at the documentation for the specific element that you're trying to work with to get the full description of that. And as we kind of mentioned there, it's a lot easier for us to just use HTML5 semantic tags. And it's actually better, code-wise, to just use HTML5 semantic tags versus using an Aria role, right? Like we have two elements here. Both of these elements are going to appear to a screen reader as exactly the same, right? We're using an article here. On the bottom, we're using a native HTML5 article tag. Whereas on the top, we're using a div, and we're adding an argument of the role of article to this to make it render to the screen reader as an article. Well, one of these is making two calls, one kind of creating the tag and one calling the role, whereas the other one's only making really one call, and that's not quite the right way to put it, right? But it helps us kind of put it in perspective here. Right? When we can use a native tag that does the same thing as Aria, that's going to simplify things. That's going to make things easier on us, and it's going to make things more efficient and easier to understand on the part of the screen reader. So that's definitely something that we're going to want to do when it's available to us. So really, that's all that I have for you for today. We'll go ahead and stop here. If you have any questions, we'll hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes. For anybody who might be here live with me who has any questions, if you are watching the recording and you have any questions, please contact me, Microsoft Teams, or email. Otherwise, We'll be in touch soon. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.